Thank you for joining us. Thank you for spending time with us today. My name is Karadina Sale, and I'm with the Community Technical Assistance Center at the New York University Silver School of Social Work's McSilver Institute. And I would just like to give you a warm welcome to today's webinar called Supporting Youth Who Exhibit Problematic Sexual Behavior with Jenny Almanzar, who is a trainer and consultant for the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth and a consultant of specialized services. Still have a lot of people joining. Hello, everyone in the chat. Welcome. So today's webinar is about problematic sexual behavior. Sexual exploration is a natural and common part of childhood human and sexual development that begins at a very young age. Sexual development includes both the sexual beliefs and knowledge that children learn, as well as the physical changes that occur as children grow. At times, the sexual behavior of children and youth become harmful to themselves and to other children. However, understanding the myths, misconceptions, and realities about the population allows for proper identification, support, and intervention. Research shows that children and youth with problematic sexual behavior can and do often change with that appropriate identification, support, and intervention. Today's presentation will help you support youth who exhibit problematic sexual behavior by understanding the complexities of the behaviors. Our presenter, Jenny Almanzar, is an LCSWR, completed her Master's of Social Work degree at Hunter College of Silberman School of Social Work in their Advanced Standing Program in New York. She has been providing services since 2002 to families impacted by childhood sexual abuse, youth with problematic or illegal sexual behavior and their families, as well as adults who have sexually offended. Jenny is currently the consultant of specialized services at the Children's Home in Binghamton, New York, a national trainer and consultant with the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth, and owner of Jenny Almanzar Consulting, LLC. She is the former director of the Journey Project at Family and Children's Counseling Services in Binghamton, New York. Jenny's clinical experience highlights her belief that addressing the family system is key to mitigating the impact of trauma, as well as managing disruptive behaviors in children. Jenny also works on the military team through NCSBY, where she trains military clinicians both in the United States and abroad in meeting the needs of youth with problematic sexual behaviors on U.S. military bases. I just want to share a note that we did ask Jenny to present with us on problematic sexual behavior in January of 2021. Vanessa's going to share that offering in the chat. And today's presentation is really an expansion on that information, primarily around myths and misconceptions, as well as an offering of hope in working with youth and their families around problematic sexual behaviors.
Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Jenny Almanzar, and I am mainly a trainer and consultant with the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth. You just heard my background, and this is kind of a follow-up to a previous training. This is the agenda. We're going to try to cover what is normative versus problematic sexual behavior. Specifically, we're going to kind of focus more on our adolescents today, so the 13 and up population. We're going to look at myths and misconceptions, principles of evidence-based treatment, recidivism, and safety planning. I'm going to do my best to try and look at the chat as much as I can. We are limited on time, and we are going to cover a lot of material. If you could put your questions in the chat, and I will get to them as best I can. My email will also be up after, and I'm more than happy to respond to questions outside of this presentation. And then also, if I could ask people to refrain from asking case-specific questions, we just may not have time to get into all that details. So as we walk through this presentation, I want you to kind of consider this case. This is of a 13-year-old Tyler who engages his 11-year-old neighbor Corey in playing the penis game. The problematic sexual behavior, so PSB is problematic sexual behavior for short, is discovered when Corey's mother walks in on them playing the game and she contacts law enforcement. Upon learning of the behavior, Tyler's parents are devastated and confused and believe that Tyler must have been sexually abused. Tyler has younger siblings at home. None of them have disclosed abuse, but there is concern about their safety in the home with Tyler. And Tyler's family is afraid that Tyler will grow up to become an adult who offends. So if you could keep that case in mind as we walk through, and we're going to kind of circle back to that at the end. So why is this topic important? So greater than 1/3 of sexual offenses against children are committed by other youth. So that's about 30%. That's an alarming amount. So keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. Approximately 1/4 of child victims are related to the youth with illegal sexual behavior, and fewer victims are strangers to the youth. And you can see that in all these, all the research and resources are shown at the end if you want to look at them more closely. So preventing sexual abuse in the first place will significantly, obviously, reduce the number of child victims. So I wanted to add this in here because New York State did just probably about a year and a half, 2 years ago, raise the lower age. So what this means is that offenses are not chargeable for children under the age of 12 in New York State, where in the past, the laws previous allowed anyone 7 years and up to be charged. We have what's called in New York a differential response or voluntary services that are offered to families when the children are under the age of 12. And so a lot of times, I know here in Broome County, that's through our Department of Social Services. I think it's done most of that in most of the counties in New York. So that would be good to find out for your own county. And so even though we're focusing today on kids 13 and up, it's good for people to know that that is a change in our system. So there's a continuum of sexual behaviors. So they range anywhere from normal and typical to cautionary and concerning to problematic and harmful. And if you look at the diagram, normal to typical is usually mutually agreed upon, baked usually in curiosity, and typically lighthearted. Where cautionary and concerning can be still normative and typical. However, it has added elements of maybe there's a big difference in age, maybe the location of where they're engaging in the behavior is becoming more concerning, like at school. It's more frequent, and then maybe there's potential consequences for the behavior. And we're going to get into that a little bit more closely. Someone's question in the chat was, if a youth was previously charged due to the lower age limit, but is still under the age of 12, does that charge disappear? If they were charged prior to the law changing, I don't believe so, but that would be something you'd want to talk about with your local law enforcement. And then problematic, it would be frequently occurring. The children are not responding to interventions, and it's negatively impacting themselves or other children. And then harmful, of course, would be any intrusive behaviors, such as penetration, use of force, intimidation, or coercion, and eliciting fear from the other child. And again, we're going to go into this a little bit more. So in order to understand what's illegal, or problematic, we have to understand what is normative behavior we're looking at 13 to 18-year-olds. So adolescents' behaviors range from naive to highly sexualized. And what that means is that we have some teenagers who know nothing about sexual behavior, and we have some teenagers who know a lot and are doing a lot of sexual behavior. And in terms of normative development, either could be considered normative in that range. Intercourse is initiated. Someone says my mic is going in and out. Intercourse is initiated earlier than in previous generations. Girls are increasing in their sexual assertiveness, so we do see that. There is increased information available. So when we think about how much kids have access to internet and information at their fingertips, even though they have that access, we know that the myths are still pervasive for them. So, for example, youth still believe things like, if we use the pull-out method, we'll be safe. Or if I have sex the first time, I can't get pregnant. Those kind of old beliefs that maybe some of us believed when we were younger. It's important to note that because even though they have the information available, those myths are still widely believed. So discussions with parents about sex does decrease early initiation. So that's the good news. We know that kids who are talking to their parents or their caregivers about sex are holding off on having sex. And so that's good news. And we know that kids are all learning, but often at a different pace. So again, some kids are learning a lot of information and some kids aren't. And that's all still within the normative range of development. So I know some people are putting in the chat that it's cutting out, but I'm also getting messages that it's not for people. So I would just encourage you to check your audio. So how would you respond to normative sexual behavior? So we would still provide education. So even if, and I'm going to give an example, let's consider like two 16-year-olds who are engaging in mutually agreed upon sexual intercourse. We may be concerned about that as adults and as parents of two 16-year-olds who are engaging in sexual intercourse, but there are still things, and even though it's not illegal, there are things we'd want to do to respond. So we would want to provide education about things like social rules of behavior, privacy, modesty, and this we would want to do actually even with our younger kids. We want to provide developmentally appropriate sex education, things about sexual health, sexual orientation, gender identity, healthy sexual behaviors and dynamics. We'd want to talk about, is the behavior that they're doing illegal? How do we know that it's a healthy relationship? How do you stay safe during sexual interactions? These are all things we would still want to do. We'd want to talk to kids about friendships and relationships with others. What are those consequences outside of getting pregnant or getting an STI that could occur from sexual behavior? A lot of kids don't think about the emotional impact that choosing to have sexual intercourse with someone may bring them. So we want to include all these things as we're educating them. And respecting their own bodies. Again, if we're talking, I know we're focusing on older youth, but if we're talking about small children, there's ways to teach consent by sharing toys and giving hugs to friends that help kids understand, their bodies are private and how to teach that at a young age. We kind of miss the mark with our kids because sometimes we don't teach those things until too late. So I also want to note that we have to keep in mind some cultural considerations when we're thinking about what is normative sexual behavior. What comes to mind for me is while I was training on a US military base in Germany, some of the clinicians had noted that in Germany, it's not unusual for youth, even in early adolescence, to be naked or nude around the house or in the on the beach. And so we have to always think about and consider what are those cultural or religious beliefs, what are the family's expectations about sexual behavior as we're teaching this to youth. And so concerning behavior, as I stated before, is still mostly normative sexual behaviors. However, there are factors that are making the behavior be concerning. So again, if the behaviors are concerning, or if the behaviors are happening in like a location such as school or a public space, that would be concerning and we'd want to intervene in that behavior. If the children are not similar in age, that might be concerning. Or if it's occurring a lot, even after we intervene, we might start getting concerned that this behavior, needs more intervention. Use of technology can contribute to concerning sexual behavior. So basically, if the behavior, even if it's not illegal, we still might have concerns about that. And also, if there's potential consequences to that youth or other children, they could get in trouble if they continue the behavior, then we would consider that to be concerning. So for concerning behavior, I just want to point out that we may still need to respond. It may look like education about things like understanding state sex laws, understanding sexual behavior rules, what is not okay to do in terms of sexual behavior. We may need to teach them social rules. We may also need to do some safety planning if the behavior is concerning and could be impactful to somebody else. Someone's question is, what's a problematic age difference? It depends. We tend to recommend that kids stay within 2 to 3 years of their age in terms of romantic partners or dating relationships. But you certainly have to factor in other things like developmental abilities, if they're the same or close to the same. Size can play a factor in that too. So there are other power differentials that you'd want to take into consideration. So what is beyond what is typical what is beyond typical and problematic and harmful? So if the behavior is frequent and excludes normal childhood activities, an example of that is we had a youth in the past who engaged in pretty consistent masturbation. So although a child engaging in masturbation alone would not be considered necessarily problematic or illegal, in this case, this youth was refraining from participating in any other types of activities that a child would normally like to do, such as playing video games or playing with friends. This child was choosing to be alone and masturbate. So that becomes more of a problematic and possibly harmful if they're creating some physical damage to themselves. On a side note, someone has a question about the age of consent in New York State. It's actually 17. So the behavior is also problematic and harmful if it does not decrease after the child has been told no, given consequences, or have been given praise for choosing other activities. So if the behavior continues even after an intervention, then that might become more problematic and harmful. If the behavior is harmful or potentially harmful to other children. So again, I'm going to use the child who was masturbating because that would not necessarily be harmful unless that child was excessively masturbating and harming themselves. But if they were doing it in a place where another child might walk in, or even an adult, then it becomes potentially harmful to someone else. And if the child coerces or forces another to participate in the sexual behavior, then that's definitely going to be problematic and harmful. And also, if it happens between children of significantly different ages or developmental disabilities or developmental abilities, then as I said before, that could be considered problematic. So problematic sexual behavior, or PSB, is usually youth-initiated behaviors, involves sexual body parts, is potentially harmful to themselves or others. And that's important to know because, again, we want to make sure that we're understanding that potentially harmful to themselves, even if it doesn't include other children, still could be considered problematic. If it's developmentally inappropriate and or legal per state or federal statutes, or clinically concerning behavior could reflect a variety of diagnoses. So I want to add there that problematic sexual behavior is not a psychiatric diagnosis. So there is no DSM diagnosis for problematic sexual behavior. However, kids can have co-occurring mental health issues along with problematic sexual behavior. And so there could be some co-occurring issues going on that may reflect a DSM diagnosis, but PSB alone would not be considered a psychiatric disorder. Someone's question is PSB rooted in youth being sexually abused by an adult? We're going to actually get to that in a little bit. So when are sexual behaviors problematic? So if they're occurring in a high frequency, so they're happening frequently, they're excluding normal childhood activities, if they're unresponsive to typical parenting strategies or intervention, if it's occurring among youth of significantly different ages or developmental disabilities, if it's longer in duration than developmentally expected. So for example, someone asked, is there an average age that boys start to masturbate? We see, I think in our research, that it's as young as 9, but certainly sexual behavior in children starts in infancy. So it's not in infancy due to sexual stimulation. However, it's more of an exploratory behavior in those earlier ages. So, we'll have people who say, my preschooler is touching their private parts, which, that is considered masturbation. However, it's what is the reason for the touching? And it's not typically for sexual stimulation. And so it's important to keep that in mind. But sexual stimulation, or they start realizing that it feels good in their bodies responding to that masturbation, that could occur at very young ages as well. So back to the developmental considerations, if it's interfering with social development, which we talked about that with the boy who didn't want to participate in other socially normative behaviors. If the behavior is intrusive, so intrusive typically would look like, maybe more of a penetration act. That would automatically be considered a problematic sexual behavior, especially if it involves another child, or even if a child is doing it to themselves with objects, that would be concerning because it could be harmful. If they use force, intimidation, or coercion, and if they're eliciting fears or anxiety in other children to get them to do the sexual behavior, that would be problematic and harmful. So for example, a child who tells another child, I won't be your friend unless you engage in this behavior, or bribes and says, I will let you play my video game if you engage in this behavior. Those are all things to consider in this area. So we're going to dispel some myths and misconceptions. So there are system challenges when dealing with youth who commit acts of problematic sexual behavior. And a lot of these challenges, they're coming from the myths and misunderstandings being widely believed, and then how we respond in our interventions if we're basing those on our misconceptions about this population. So myth number 1, and this was someone's question in the chat. Youth with problematic sexual behavior have been sexually abused. So do youth who exhibit problematic sexual behavior have a history of being sexually abused? So most of the time, people believe that this is true, that they must have been sexually abused. And often when problematic sexual behavior is discovered, that's the first question that the child who's exhibiting the problematic sexual behavior gets asked. However, so here's our historical assumption that if a child is exhibiting problematic sexual behavior, they must have been sexually abused. However, that is a myth. So children with problematic sexual behavior are more at risk for actually future victimization. So they're more at risk of becoming a victim of someone else. But there's a but here. Children with a sexual abuse history are more at risk for developing problematic sexual behavior than children without a sexual abuse history. However, only a small number of children who have been sexually abused develop PSB. I know that seems very confusing. We're more likely to see children who have sexual abuse victimizations that develop problematic sexual behavior in our preschool age children. That's about 33% may develop problematic sexual behavior. In our school age children, it's about 6% have developed, so school age and up, 6% have developed problematic sexual behavior. We're going to talk more about that. So we know that being sexually abused could be a motivator. However, there are a lot of other motivators or drivers for problematic sexual behavior that are more prevalent than sexual abuse. And those are witnessing domestic violence. And by the way, tomorrow is wear your purple for domestic violence support. Physical abuse and exposure to sexualized environments and pornography actually have more of a prevalence of developing problematic sexual behavior than children being sexually abused. And again, that goes against what we all believed for a very long time. So, children with a sexual abuse history, it is a risk factor for problematic sexual behavior, but more in our preschool age children. Um, Children with PSB actually are more at risk for being a future victim, as I said before. And many children with PSB have no history of child sexual abuse. And the origins of that are very complex, which we're going to get into. But characteristics of child sexual abuse or children who've been sexually abused that are more likely to lead to exhibiting PSB is, again, those younger age kids, but also kids who've had multiple incidents of sexual abuse by different people, so multiple perpetrators, and whose sexual behavior was more frequent and intrusive, such as penetration. So those are the factors that make it more of a likelihood of children developing problematic sexual behavior in terms of sexual abuse victimization. So are some of the other drivers or motivations for problematic sexual behavior. So we just went through part of the modeling of sexuality, and that's part of that is like children who may have been sexually abused, especially those preschool age children that we talked about. This also could be poor boundaries in the home. It could be modeling sexual behavior in the home or exposure to sexual behavior in the home. That could be a possible motivator. And also exposure to pornography in a child's home, or just exposure to pornography in general. All children have cell phones, so they literally could be exposed to pornography right while they're anywhere. So those all would fall in the modeling of sexuality. In poor boundaries, so families maybe who, we'll have families who maybe watch Family Guy together. That's a cartoon, but it's for adults, and there's a lot of sexual behavior and talk in those shows. So we have had a lot of kids actually talk about being exposed to things like that. So that would all fall under one of the driver areas, which is the modeling of sexuality. And then we have the modeling of coercion, and this is the one I was talking about before that does have a higher prevalence of connection to problematic sexual behavior. And those are children who are exposed to physical abuse, witnessing domestic violence, peer and community violence, and harsh parenting practices. So those are all motivators for PSB, and it falls under the modeling of coercion. And then the child vulnerabilities. And I know one of the questions was, what would be co-occurring disorders? And co-occurring disorders could be anything that would be a DSM diagnosis. So they reach the level of symptoms that are equatable to a DSM diagnosis. What I will say about them, we certainly have kids who struggle in this area with impulse control, with social skill issues, poor reading of social cues, developmental and verbal delays, and other types of behavioral problems. But I want to be clear that there are no, it doesn't increase necessarily kids who have co-occurring disorders such as ADHD or autism spectrum disorder, where we see those impulse control problems. They are no more likely to develop problematic sexual behavior than any other child. So I want to be very clear about that. It doesn't mean they're going to develop problematic sexual behavior. It just means that sometimes we can see these vulnerabilities that do increase the possibility that that could develop. Someone asked for a harsh example of a harsh parenting practice. So harsh parenting practices could be using excessive force when disciplining, hitting with objects. That might be something that would consider harsh parenting. So, we recommend when we're talking with families who have had children exhibit problematic sexual behavior and their families have exhibited harsh parenting practices, a lot of times it comes from one parent and then the other parent might be too passive. And so to get them on the same page to parent in a way that is helpful to the youth, as opposed to one kind of being on different ends of the spectrum. And then the last motivator or driver that we're going to kind of talk about is family adversity. So These are factors that interfere with parental guidance and supervision. So, if a parent has a mental health struggle or a substance abuse issue, if the family feels isolated, having multiple stressors that they're dealing with, if you have a parent who's being pulled in a lot of different directions and struggling to provide adequate supervision, those could all fall under this category. My understanding from all the families I've seen in my 20+ year career is a lot of times they have a little piece of different ones. So it's not just one area. A lot of times what we're seeing is multiple areas are being touched on. So we're going to talk about the impact of technology real quick on sexual behaviors. So we know that there's increased access to technology. Youth are frequently and regularly online. Older youth are actually more likely to view sexualized media, which I kind of feel like is good news in this situation. So we do know that as youth go up in age, they increase in their access to pornography or online or digital behavior such as sexting. So I feel like that's a little bit of good news in here. Rates of pornography use in children increases with age and peaks in early adulthood. So again, we are seeing kids as young as 10 years old, um, you know, being exposed to pornography, but we do know what the research is showing us is that it's actually increases with age. So the older they get, the more likely they are to engage in pornography use. Rates of children sexting are actually not as high as we commonly believed. So that's also some good news, although it does increase with age. And child sexual abuse material, which is also called CSAM, formerly called child pornography, also sometimes called sexual exploitation material, versus youth-produced images versus sexualized images are all different. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a minute. There is a question here. Oh, that's more of a technical issue. Okay. Is there any correlation between religious expectations within families and PSB? I don't know that there's any specific noted correlation. We certainly see struggles with this in families, especially if there's a high sense of restriction around even talking about sex or asking questions about sex. And so we'll see kids sometimes turn to the internet to get those information or to turn to other peers, which both those aren't great ways to learn about that information. So, but in terms of do kids with religious expectations, do those families exhibit higher likelihoods of PSB? I have not seen that. So here's a little bit of data for teen exposure to pornography. 90% of boys and 60% of girls are exposed to pornography before age 18. Some level of exposure to pornography is occurring before age 13 in 50% of males and 33% of females. And almost a third of teens are exposed to pornography before the age of 10. So approximately 2/3 of teens, pornography exposure is unwanted and unwarranted. And those are things like pop-ups or somebody else showing them or sending them pornography. So it's unwanted or they didn't request it. A question is aggressive sex considered a mental health issue? Not to my knowledge, no. Now, if it's harming another person and the other person is not, is not interested in aggressive sex, then that would be not so much a mental health issue, but maybe a legal issue. So pornography and attitudes and knowledge. I do want to clarify this, that it's important that we note that this isn't what the pornography that youth are looking at is not still images like a Playboy, like maybe some of us were exposed to growing up. That's not what they're viewing. What they're viewing is actual sex acts that are involving violence, lack of consent, stereotyping of populations, and many established views about sex for the future that are unrealistic and set up unrealistic expectations for youth as they develop into adulthood. And so I want to be clear that we're not saying, if a youth looks at a still image of a Playboy or something like that, of a magazine, that that's going to be completely negatively impacting. That's not what we're saying, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about very um, very different pornography that kids are exposed to today, and we're going to get into that a little bit more. So increased pornography viewing was linked with erroneous sexual knowledge, regardless of age, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, or pornography dependency for 14 to 18-year-olds. The more youth watched pornography, the more likely they were to be exposed to unrealistic pornography, which in turn increased their incorrect knowledge about sex. I wanted to just make a note here that, the stuff that they're viewing can set up not only confusion for them and disappointment later on in actual romantic relationships, but they're also, it's the accessibility to pornography is not monitored really by anyone. So like cell phone companies don't monitor the accessibility or control access to pornography. That can only be done by instituting like controls. And something to think about, Pornhub, which is the #1 or the leading pornography website, has more traffic than Pinterest, PayPal, and Tumblr combined. So we're talking about a lot of access, and these are kids accessing this as well as adults. So in terms of a meta-analysis that was done here, found adolescent sexting was associated with increased sexual behavior, increased anxiety and depression, delinquent behavior, substance use, and associations were stronger among younger youth. So if they were younger and looking at pornography, these things were occurring more. Another recent study found that only non-consensual sexting, so receiving unsolicited text, forwarding sex, requesting sex, soliciting sex, was associated with poorer outcomes. So there's a little bit of a mixed review there. There was let me pull this up here. It's this next one. So there was this study that was done on this slide, and you have the resource there. So youth reported communicating about sex and pornography more frequently with their best friends than with their parents. So that's not surprising to us, right? They talk to their friends. Unfortunately, their friends don't always give them adequate information. Less than 20% had talked about it with either their parents, but many of them were talking about it with their friends. There is no link between talking about sexting or pornography with parents and the youth's reported engagement of the behavior. So what that means is if kids did talk about it with their caregivers, they weren't, sometimes parents will say, well, I don't want to give my kids any ideas, but we know that's not the case. I want to just jump back to this slide though, because there was some important information from this study that is not on the slide that I wanted to highlight. So this study used true or false questions to assess sexual knowledge in 14 to 18-year-olds. And some of the following misconceptions were found in their answers. So there were 4 that I highlighted because I found them interesting. So of this group of 14 to 18-year-olds, some of the misconceptions were that most women would enjoy receiving anal sex. Most people prefer rough sex. Most men would rather have sex with multiple partners than be in an exclusive relationship. And on average, they believed that sex lasted 30 minutes or longer. So it's important that we kind of note that, because this is the information they're gathering, most likely from talking to each other, talking to their peers, but also the misinformation they're getting online. Okay. There'll be some resources up at the end. I'm just responding to the. So another question that we get a lot is about what we call youth produced images, or those nude pictures that youth are taking. And people will ask, is that considered problematic sexual behavior? So we need to distinguish child pornography or child sexual abuse material versus youth produced images. And a lot of times they're kind of wrapped up and being considered the same thing. So some localities, they do view sexting as child pornography. So if a youth sends an image, a nude image of themselves to another youth, some states may view that as sexting. I'm sorry, as child pornography, creating child pornography. Some places will more focus that on being what they call youth produced images and maybe want to recommend like treatment or education to address that. It's important that you understand where you live and how that's handled. And honestly, in New York, it's important that you check with each of your counties, because counties do, even though we have a New York State, penal code, counties sometimes will handle things differently. We want to make sure that we're understanding that these things depend on the age of the children. So if this is a 16-year-old sending nude images versus a 10-year-old, then that would be very, that would be very concerning, and we wouldn't look at it the same as we would if it's a 10-year-old. We also need to understand if both parties are who have the image or who are receiving the image are mutually agreed that the image was, agreed upon. Like, for example, if a 16-year-old girl sends a nude image to her boyfriend, did he want the image? Did she want to send it? We have to look at these things. And it also depends on how often has this happened before. Is this an ongoing thing that's happening with this youth, that they're continuing to send these images? So this typology, and this is Woloch and Finkelhor. Finkelhor is an amazing researcher who does a lot of sexual abuse research. But they put out this typology, and I found it very helpful to understand this issue. Teens need to know that engaging in electronic sexual behavior can have legal ramifications. So again, they need to understand that depending on where they live, there could be some charges around this type of thing. So I'm going to break these down. If we go over to the aggravated side, these are so youth produced images, or a youth who takes nude photos of themselves or some other type of explicit photo. And the aggravated would look like something that has a criminal or abusive element. So maybe like an adult soliciting photos from a minor, or minors sending images to adults for some other illegal involvement. This could look like sexual abuse, sextortion. You may have heard of revenge porn, use of deception or threats or malicious conduct to get someone to send them an image. So, or sending or creating an image without someone's knowledge. So this could be like putting a phone in a bathroom or a dressing room, or putting a phone up somebody's skirt as they walk by. All those would fall under the aggravated side of youth produced images. Experimental would look more like a youth who created an image and sent it without legal or illegal or malicious intent. Generally, this is done for a romantic reason, attention seeking. It's not necessarily considered normative sexual behavior, but it does fall still in normal development, in the sense that, youth will have the impulse to flirt, to find a partner, to get attention, or experiment around sex. I'm getting now that I'm breaking up. I'm not seeing why. Okay. So it's important to really, if you get a youth who is producing images, that you really look at this and determine, is it more experimental or is it really more aggravated? Okay, so the myth number 2, youth with PSB need residential treatment or intensive residential treatment. So that is a myth. Most youth with PSB can be safely treated while living at home or in their community. Residential treatment should be reserved, and I want to be very clear, we need residential treatment programs, but it should be reserved for the most severe cases, such as children with other psychiatric disorders who are highly aggressive with sexual behavior, which may be reoccurring despite appropriate outpatient treatment and close supervision. Those are the kids we would consider for residential treatment. Factors that we consider when we're doing an assessment of a youth with PSB is we look at things like, can the family provide adequate supervision? Is this youth willing to follow a safety plan? Is the family believing that there's an issue that needs to provide adequate supervision? Is there an impacted child in the home who feels unsafe? So these are all things that we would look at in an assessment, in a holistic assessment, to consider if we need to make a recommendation for residential treatment. But it certainly should not be something that's done across the board. So other possible reasons that a youth might need residential or inpatient treatment: if they're aggressive or their problematic sexual behavior is intrusive and continues to occur despite efforts to supervise or provide treatment. So for example, if you have a youth who is in community-based treatment and they're just not doing well, not following the rules, continuing to engage in inappropriate behavior, that might be a child who is in need of residential treatment. If the caregiver's capacity to implement treatment recommendations or supervise and monitor that youth, that also could possibly mean, recommend a recommendation for placement. An example of that I can give is we had a family who they were in community-based treatment, and they had all kinds of services in place to help this youth remain in a community-based program. But the caregivers were not supervising. And so there was a reoccurrence of problematic sexual behavior during a time that the caregivers allowed the youth to play unsupervised with another child. And so at that point, it was determined that a residential program would be more needed because the youth wasn't getting the type of supervision that was required. Or if the youth have severe behavioral and emotional problems that render them unable to function in the community or in a specialized school setting. If they have mental health issues that require medication and intensive in-home approaches or outpatient treatment has not been working. Or if the children requiring the level of care, they have some severe trauma history or some severe comorbid emotional and behavioral problems that require them to be in a safer living situation or a more structured situation. Again, though, this is not the typical youth that we see with problematic sexual behavior. Most of the youth can be treated in a community-based setting. So when we're thinking of considerations of residential inpatient treatment, our concerns are that the direct involvement of caregivers in treatment can be challenging. So as you heard in my bio, I'm a consultant of specialized services for the Children's Home here in Binghamton, and we have residential programs. And a lot of our youth are from counties that are more rural and far away, where the families are not able to attend regularly. We have to utilize things such as Zoom or telehealth methods to interact, and that can be very challenging. And also the family is not maybe able to visit as much as we'd want them to. If there's they could require significant positive behavioral control to reduce impact of antisocial behavior of peers. So what that means is when we put kids in residential settings, we are putting a lot of kids with bad or negative behaviors with other kids with negative behaviors. And so that can become quite challenging. There's also a disruption of social attachments and normative activities. So, they're having to leave their school districts, they're having to leave maybe activities that they're involved in. So there's a disruption of that. And it's very difficult for a youth to come back into their community after being placed away. It's very hard to acclimate them back to that. And of course, there's a lot of labeling and stigma and a potential for victimization. The advantages of considering residential or inpatient treatment is it is a controlled environment and there are high levels of supervision. There's multidisciplinary care, so a lot of their needs are addressed. They have daily and multiple treatment contacts because their treatment providers are right on site. And there's immediate community protection. You know, the safety of the community is taken into consideration. So there are advantages for residential or inpatient treatment. And of course, the safety of the child from themselves. So again, I want to highlight though, with proper assessment, treatment, and safety planning with a caregiver and a caregiver's active involvement, a youth can remain in their home and in their community safely. We do know through the research that the caregiver's involvement in treatment is the number one predictor of success for that youth long term. So myth number 3, youth with PSB will continue to offend, or they'll grow up to become adults who sexually offend. I do see your question about current assessment tools. I'm going to get to that in a minute. So there's a lot of labels that are used for adolescents who have problematic sexual behavior. And we hear words like offender, perpetrator, predator, pedophile. I'm sure you've heard a lot of these terms. In other states, we've even heard of kids when they're in detention. Some of our other states, they have jumpsuits that they might wear with like SO and the number and their number on the back. So SO means sex offender. However, the labels we use to refer to youth with problematic sexual behavior in treatment settings, they directly impact how these youth are viewed by their families and the community. And research has demonstrated that when the term juvenile sex offender is employed, people tend to respond punitively and harshly towards these youth as opposed to focusing on the actual behavior itself. So we would recommend to move away from those labels and focus more on the behavior. So that's why we call them youth with problematic sexual behavior. Even in the adult world, I'm also, my background is also working with adults who have sexually offended. We don't use the word sex offender a lot anymore. We also use the word adults who sexually offend. People do have sometimes a response to that, but definitely with juveniles, we want to stay away from those labels and remind ourselves that these are still children. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these slides just for time constraints, but in terms of youth charged versus adults who are charged with sexual offenses, they are very different. And so it's important to note that our youth tend to be more opportunistic, more based out of curiosity, less predatory, and they repeat the behavior less often. There are fewer sexually abusive behaviors over short periods of time with our youth, and they have less aggressive sexual behaviors than adults who sexually offend. They're rarely fixated in their sexual interests. Their illegal behaviors often are experimental. And so I want to point that out because it is very rare, and I'm going to say that again, it's very rare for a youth with problematic sexual behavior to be deviant in their sexual interests or have a fixated interest in prepubescent children. And so that is different than somebody who may be an adult who sexually offends, but there's also different types of adults who sexually offend, and they're not all pedophiles. So we have to, that's a whole nother conversation, but for youth anyways, we do see youth who have express sexual interest in young children. However, it is rare. We already talked about that, so I'm going to go on. Sorry, there's a slight delay when I click the page. So we can safely, youth who have problematic sexual behavior can safely attend public schools. They can participate in activities. We want them to do those things. We want them to have positive social interactions. Mental health professionals regard illegal sexual behavior by youth as reflecting much less serious psychological problems than similar behaviors by adults. So again, these are the differences. Our youth are more than 9 out of 10 times their arrest for a sex offense is a one-time event. So that's important to note. Youth's brains are amendable to grow and change, and therefore are amendable to rehabilitation. They're able to develop new skills and learn new value systems that can help prevent the reoccurrence of problematic sexual behavior. Unfortunately, we do still see programs that treat youth and adults who sexually offend the same. And these programs tend to miss the mark because they're focusing still on reducing that sexual deviant interest and missing really the failing to identify the actual beneficial treatment components for youth with problematic sexual behavior. Like things like addressing their home environment, their social skills, their communication patterns, and facilitating work with their caregiver to help provide them with support and supervision. So when we don't do those things, we're missing the mark with youth. So the recidivism rates, so using evidence-based practices improves the outcomes and reduces, there's a reduction in recidivism. Sorry, that was written kind of strange. What that means is typically there's a 3 to 12% recidivism rate for juveniles versus 8 to 58% for other delinquent behavior. So what that means is that we know kids with problematic sexual behavior, the recidivism rates are actually really low. They're 3 to 12%. And we know that with treatment, with effective treatment and evidence-based treatment, it could be as low as 3 to 5% recidivism rate. So this leads us to, we need to think about how we operate with juveniles, knowing that these recidivism rates are low, because people tend to think once someone sexually abuses, they're going to continue to sexually abuse. But with juveniles, that is not the case. Someone wrote, what is the risk of becoming an adult perpetrator when the youth does not receive intervention for PSB? So again, even without intervention, it's still only 3 to 12%. It's still very low. Recidivism means doing the behavior again, reoffending. So again, I'm going to say that again. Recidivism rates, or doing problematic sexual behavior again, is actually really low, 3 to 12%. With correct evidence-based treatment, it can be as low as 3 to 5%. So that's an incredibly high number, and it's not something people often consider. So youth develop and mature and most frequently stop engaging in all types of offending. Research has found reduced risk of violent recidivism, even with youth who have psychopathic features. So what they're saying is, even with youth who've had psychopathic symptoms or features, they still recidivate sexually at a low rate. Holistic interventions that include the youth, family, involve the social system have the most evidence of effectiveness. As I stated earlier, youth whose characters are involved in treatment have the most evidence of effectiveness long-term. Juvenile registration and notification policies have not been found to improve public safety. Research has indicated that registration of juveniles does not improve recidivism, and instead, it actually causes a negative effect, because then we see more things like the child becoming suicidal, being harassed, having mental health problems, in essence, kind of giving up. So if you're put on a registry as a juvenile, we don't see positive outcomes associated with that, not in community safety and not for that juvenile. And then all treatments are helpful. And so you've heard me kind of say this about treatment. We know that not all treatments are helpful to youth. I'm going to go through these real quick. It's important because this presentation is not specific to treatment. That might have to be a separate presentation, but we know what works is evidence-based models of treatment. and that use the risk, need, and responsivity approach. And you may have heard that before. It's called the R&R model. And so the risk part of that is it prioritizes supervision and treatment resources for the youth who have the most significant vulnerabilities and risk factors present. Unfortunately, what we've done in the past is we tend to put all kids with problematic sexual behavior in all the same type of treatment. And that doesn't always work. First of all, we don't all have the resources to do that. And we want to put the resources, which would be more cost effective, into treatment and prosecution for youth who have high risk factors. So there's other things we can do with youth who maybe respond well to community-based interventions and have access to protective factors. We might do something different. So risk is important that we look at that. And then need means direct interventions toward criminogenic needs, which are those characteristics, traits, or problems or issues that an individual may have that contribute to their likelihood of reoffending and committing another crime. And that's why holistic assessment is so important, that you're looking at these areas. And then responsivity, we should assign interventions while considering temperament, developmental age, learning style, motivation, gender, family characteristics, and culture. So we need to look at all of these things as we're working with youth in treatment, and not just do a cookie cutter type of treatment. In some of the models of treatment, they may be workbook based, or they may be curriculum based or module based, but you can still tailor them to using this responsivity and looking at what are those specific things that each family needs. So we know that enhancing motivation, interactions that contribute to increasing the youth's internal drive for positive behaviors, the things that we do that help motivate them to look at their strengths and improve interpersonal interactions, those using models that are warm and open and reduce the shame that they're feeling, those tend to be more successful. So it's important to consider dosage of treatment. So again, if you have the kids that are with low risk and have a lot of protective factors in place and a lot of support, you would want to really think about how you're treating them versus kids who have a lot of risk factors at place and lack protective factors. We want to increase positive reinforcement for youth, and we want to engage them in their communities. So the current problems are that not all treatments are the same. Many services for youth with PSB are based on adult sex offender models. Many only see the child and fail to address the family. I'm a big advocate that the caregiver or a caregiver or a support system should be included almost weekly with the youth in treatment, because they're the ones who have to manage the behaviors and provide the supervision outside of treatment. Services tend to be fragmented and lack of coordination across services. For example, if you're working with a family where the impacted child was also in the family, as well as the PSB child, those services should be working together to help this family, but not fragmented. And of course, why I'm here talking and why there's 700 people on this call today is because we lack available experts. We lack evidence-based treatment programs, and that is an ongoing issue, not just here in New York, but across the country. I talked about those. I'm going to just move forward. So what is problematic sexual behavior, cognitive behavioral therapy? So as you know, I am a national trainer and consultant with the National Center on the Sexual Behavior of Youth. We actually, that centers through Oklahoma University's Center for Child Abuse and Neglect, and that is the developer of what we call the Oklahoma model, or PSB CBT. I'm not here to train on this model. I'm just here to note that this is the model that we use. It is empirically based. We have models for preschool age children, school age, and adolescents. And it does all involve an active caregiver in treatment. So that is one evidence-based treatment model. Multisystemic therapy is another one that is empirically based for this population. Trauma-focused CBT has a advanced component for youth with PSB. So there are other options, and this is just one of them. These are the programs that we've trained in New York. So I just wanted people to kind of have a quick sense of where some of these programs are. As of within 6 months, I have looked at all these programs and they are still active. Unfortunately, they do change a lot as we see providers leave different agencies. But certainly these are some options if you're located in one of these areas. These are places that serve problematic sexual behavior. I do see in the chat, New York City ? New York City, I believe there is a place in the Bronx. It is very limited. In New York City, they are trying to address that. I'm more than happy off this training to answer any questions or try to connect people to services, and you can contact me through my email. But definitely there are sparse resources across the state, and we are working on that. So myth number 5, a lack of empathy is a risk factor. So if the child who exhibits illegal and problematic sexual behavior denies their behavior or seems to not empathize, what does that mean about their risk for future offense treatment? So for example, the child has no remorse. If it's not on my slide, somebody's asking about a specific place. These are the places that were specifically done through the Oklahoma model, and that's the updated one. There could be others that I just don't have on there, but as far as I know, those are the most updated ones. So in terms of empathy as a risk factor, what does empathy mean? So the child understands that they are a distinct person from those around them, and that other people may have different feelings and perspectives than their own. They can recognize feelings in themselves and others and name them. They can regulate their own emotional responses. They can put themselves in someone else's shoes and imagine how someone might feel, and can imagine what kind of action or response might help a person feel better. That's what empathy means. I can tell you most adults don't even do these things. Definitely not all of them, and some people not even any of them. So we definitely hold kids to a higher standard than we do, our youth. So the problem here is that the brain that facilitates the development of empathy is not fully developed until we're like late adolescence or early adulthood. We can teach empathy, we can teach about moral development, we can role model it for them, but to expect them to fully grasp this concept of empathy is really just not developmentally possible. The prefrontal lobe responsible for planning and decision-making and goal setting is still a work in progress around this time. And the part of the brain responsible for putting the brakes on impulsive actions and runaway emotions is not even yet online. So think about adolescence. I know I have a 17-year-old and a 12-year-old, and my 17-year-old could be slamming the door in my face one minute and then crying the next minute that she's so sorry. It's like this emotional roller coaster. And that's just where they are in this developmental stage. We hope that, well, let me back up. Let me talk about denial. We actually expect that kids are going to deny things to us. They're going to deny on some level some part of their behavior. Who wants to talk about not only this sexual stuff, which is very embarrassing and even difficult for adults, but who wants to talk about things they've done wrong? Most people don't want to. So what we hope is that by being empathetic ourselves to youth, creating a comfortable environment, that some of that embarrassment, shame will subside, and that we'll be able to talk about things with them. But again, I just want to highlight that if they're not showing the kind of empathy that we hope they would show, it does not mean that they're at a greater risk to reoffend. So there is no link to the lack of remorse or empathy with recidivism for problematic sexual behavior. So we are running out of time, so I'm going to just highlight a couple of things here. So children with problematic sexual behavior, they need external controls. So their internal controls or internal decision making is not working. Therefore, we have to heighten the external controls, which are things like rules and limits and consequences. And we don't want to do it to be punitive or to punish, but we want to do it to ensure safety. Once they learn how to manage those internal controls better, then some of the rules can start to subside. I love this slide because all the people in the chat that are saying, we need to be trained and we don't know what to do. Here's some things you can do. These are what we build our treatment around. So these are the protective factors. So if you can increase healthy supports that are supported, healthy boundaries that are supported and modeled by their environment, their caregivers, the adults in their life, if you can help them be safe from harm and trauma, so teaching them abuse prevention, because remember, our PSV kids are more likely to be victimized in the future, but helping their families and their caregivers to keep them safe, increase supervision and guidance, help them learn to communicate with their caregivers, develop those social skills and develop healthy friendships, open communication about their feelings with their trusted adult. If a youth feels they can turn to their adult caregiver for support or questions that they might have about sexual behavior, that's the best case scenario, because then they're not going online or talking to their peers. If we can provide them with successful experiences, a lot of youth who exhibit problematic sexual behavior are kind of failing in a lot of other places and typically are struggling all the way around. And so finding successful experiences, even if it means, I mean, we had a kid once, we really struggled to find something that was successful with him. And one day he wore clean socks, and we just highlighted how great that was that he wore clean socks. And I know that sounds ridiculous, but it was a starting point for him. And that boy ended up being successful with treatment as we chipped away at all these different protective factors with him and his family. And then helping them to build those adaptive coping skills, because life is hard and there's going to be a lot of challenges in the future. So developing those coping skills is going to be super helpful. So these are all things you can do immediately that reduces the risk of problematic sexual behavior. These are also the things that you should be assessing in your assessment. So let's talk about risk assessment real quick. Again, this isn't meant to be a treatment or assessment specific webinar, but I did want to touch on things. There are many developed risk assessment tools, but it is a changing area. So before we get into safety planning, I just want to kind of mention that. So risk assessment with youth can be kind of tricky. And the reason that it's tricky is because their risk factors are highly linked to their environment, which is ever changing. So it's very transient in nature. We want to think about, we want to refrain from using things like they're low, medium, or high risk. And I know a lot of times you go to court or people will ask you to give your opinion on if a youth is low, medium, or high risk. However, I would encourage you to stay away from that language, as that's really meant to kind of talk about the adult system and the risk assessment tools that are available for adults. There are some tools that are available for juveniles. You've probably heard of some of them. There's the Eraser, the Professor, the J-SOAP. And although those are still widely used, the developers of those risk assessment tools have actually gotten together and created a new risk assessment tool called the Youth Needs and Progress Scale. And the Youth Needs and Progress Scale is directly linked to their ever-changing development and environment. And it gets away from labeling the low, medium, high, and really more focuses on what are the treatment issues here that we need to address? What are the vulnerabilities for this youth, and what are the protective factors, and how do we build treatment around those factors to improve and build a higher sense of protective factors? So assessments really should be holistic and include multiple sources that adequately look at all of a child's environment and not only that, but also assessing out what's their normative sexual. Oh, we got some pretty colors happening. What's their normative sexual history? We also need to look at that because that's how we can try to look at it, what's concerning here, what needs to be addressed. In terms of safety planning, many children, again, can remain in their home and their community, even with other children. Assessment of youth with PSP and their caregiver will be important to determining this, and as well as the safety plan. The caregiver is going to be key to developing an adequate plan, and they must believe that there's a perceived risk of the child continuing PSP in order to properly supervise. We really should include and consider the child's environment, such as things like having their own room. Are they able to have eyes on supervision with other children? What are the rules around privacy in the home? These are some things to consider with the safety plan. The caregiver needs to understand their liability as a supervisor, and as well as anyone who's in a caretaking role of these youth. So if there's a daycare provider or somebody who supervises them with other children, they really should know what the safety plan is. My recommendation is that there's at least one person at the school who's aware of what the safety plan is. I typically would say the social worker or somebody who has to follow, privacy and HIPAA, because you don't want their business being out there. Youth should be able to work through this issue privately, but certainly having someone know at the school would be helpful in case something comes up at school, so that that person is aware of the safety plan. I look purple on my screen. I don't know what I look like on your screen, but I don't know why I'm purple. So I apologize for that if I do look purple. I'm so purple, I know. Sorry, I don't know why my screen's not changing either. Okay, here we go. So it's Halloween. Oh, it's for Domestic Violence Awareness Month tomorrow, that's why. Okay, so developing a safety plan with caregivers. Identify and include all relevant caregivers and professionals. Identify appropriate siblings impacted by the activities that are going to be on the safety plan. Identify the caregiver's responses and actions. What are their responsibilities? Teach the children what to do. I am plugged in. Teach the children what to do if they're not following the plan. Components of a safety plan could include the child with PSB not being allowed in other people's rooms. The child must leave if another child comes into the room and there's no supervisor. Not bathing, never be involved in bathing or caregiving of another child. Not have others in the bathroom. Oh, I don't know what is happening. We are going crazy. Okay. Everyone in the home should be fully clothed. So really teaching boundaries and privacy. We say no horseplay, wrestling, or tickling, and that's because we want to avoid private parts being accidentally touched, because that could create a situation in the home. So those are just some components of a safety plan. Now, real quick, I want to go back to revisiting our case. So again, 13-year-old Tyler engages his 11-year-old neighbor Corey in playing the penis game. The PSB is discovered when Corey's mother walks in on them playing the game, and she contacts law enforcement. Upon learning of the behavior, Tyler's parents are devastated and confused and believe that Tyler must have been sexually abused. Tyler has younger siblings at home. None of them have disclosed abuse, but there is concern about their safety in the home. Tyler's family is afraid that Tyler will grow up to become an adult who offends. So now that the penis game in this case was the boys were touching each other's penis and putting their mouths on each other's penis. So I want you to just think about that case. Has everything we talked about changed your thoughts about that case since we started? Would you do something different than contacting law enforcement? How would you approach this family? Have any of your misconceptions been corrected that you can teach this family understanding about? So again, we're not going to go through it all, but I just wanted I wanted to leave you with something that is very typical for us, which is a family presents with all those misconceptions. And a lot of times the professionals involved present with those misconceptions, and how we guide that family is really going to, you know, depend on what our own belief systems are about this population. So to recap, youth sexual behaviors range from normative to cautionary to problematic and harmful. Identifying where the youth falls on the continuum is important to develop a plan for them. There are many myths about youth with PSP that are still widely believed. Recidivism rates are between 3 and 12%, with a lower percentage given to youth who have completed treatment. Youth with PSP are most successful when communities utilize evidence-based practices. Safety plans are essential to progress and reduction of PSP. And the takeaways are the following are myths. There are many motivators for youth who exhibit PSP other than sexual abuse. Youth with PSP do not necessarily need intensive or residential treatment. There is no research to support youth with PSP will grow up to become adults who sexually offend. There are practices to treat youth with PSP that can be harmful, and a lack of empathy is not a risk factor for future problematic sexual behavior. These are some resources for you. The other thing I really wanted to leave you with is hope, because the number one thing we can give families who seek out services for problematic sexual behavior is that this is a very hopeful and treatable situation. And that is not what most families are going to believe when they come to you. But we have very low recidivism rates, and most of our youth with correct treatment and who complete treatment with supportive caregivers grow up and never have problematic sexual behavior again. And many of them even resolve a lot of their other co-occurring issues as well, because treatment components involve cognitive behavioral therapy techniques. So there are some resources I'm going to put up. There's some recommended readings. There's some references. These will all be in the slides. And here are my emails if anyone has any other questions. And I thank you all so much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenny. This was amazing. Everybody is chiming in the chat, wondering when you're going to train again. I think this is a very much needed discussion and information around this important topic. There's a quick survey that's going to come up in your chat, so please fill it out so we can see what you got out of today, and if you have any other requests for future training. We do have time for maybe one question. Vanessa, did you want to read? Is there any questions that came in that you'd want to read to us?
I think one of the questions that two questions that frequently came up would be resources about books or materials to help deepen understanding of this topic. And I think a second question that came up is, what is the best way to have conversations about sex with parents who are not willing to do so or are convinced it will make them want to have sex?
So I want to refer everyone to ncsby.org. ncsby.org is our National Center's website, and there is a wealth of information on there, including all kinds of information about, preschool and children, school-age children, and adolescents. But there's lots of helpful information there for parents and caregivers to help them with that kind of information that you were just talking about. So I would refer you to that website, because we just redid it and there's a wealth of information on there.
Great. Okay, so you have a lot of resources and recommended readings. I wanted to go over some upcoming events for CTAC. And again, you will receive these slides in about 2 to 3 business days. Everything will be posted on our website at ctacny.org. We have a few upcoming events: facilitating engagement, the LEAP approach for providers working with adults lacking awareness of their condition, on October 17th, tomorrow. And then we have a 2-part event coming up on youth and technology, redefining mental health. Part 1 is on October 30th, and then part 2 is on November 13th. So hoping you can join us for those events. I just really, again, want to thank you, Jenny, for sharing your expertise and sharing some purple with us in honor of tomorrow. And if you have other questions or concerns, you can reach out to Jenny, or you can also reach out to us. We'd love to hear from you. Please complete that survey before you leave. And I just hope you all have a wonderful day. Any last thoughts, Jenny?
No, I thank you all for spending time with me.
All right, take good care, everyone. Until next time.